Hello, everybody. Welcome to Community Conversations. I'm the facilitator, Courtney Shaw, and I'm very pleased to introduce a new person that I've wrangled into working with me this quarter. Jennifer Hoage is a mental health and school counselor. She earned her MS in psychology from Eastern Washington University in 1998, and she worked in K-12 for a few years before joining LCC 12 years ago. Please welcome Jennifer Hoage.
Hello. This is the first time I've done this. I'm slightly terrified, but hopefully I'll be, I won't faint or anything like that. I am hoping that we can have a little bit of communication or conversation and discourse around some of these topics so that I just feel like it sinks in a little bit more when we are able to talk about some of these issues and at least as far as mental health goes, eliminate some of the stigma there is around mental health issues. So we're going to be talking today about the myths about mental illness and mental health. And so, hopefully we can have some conversation. How many of you have yourself or know people, have friends, family members who have had mental health issues? Yeah, almost everybody. And that's not surprising to me because when I was doing the research for this, I saw the numbers and it's pretty common. So, okay, we're going to talk about the myths and what the facts are. So first of all, we're going to talk about mental illness. Is it real? Some people think it's not. So we're going to talk about the facts. And while we're talking, if you have a question or a comment, just raise your hand, and I'm okay with questions or comments while I'm in the middle of the talking, I guess. Okay. Myth number one, mental illness is weakness. People can just snap out of it. We all know that it is an illness. It's not a character flaw. It's not something that you can just make go away by thinking it should go away. It takes a lot of strength physically and emotionally and mentally to get treatment and help for mental health issues. Mental illness is not real and cannot be treated. As a counselor, I know that's not true. So it's diagnosable. Mental illness is treatable just like any physical illness, whether by medication or by talk therapy. Mental illness is not a true medical condition. It actually can be just as debilitating as any physical ailment. And a lot of mental illness is biological in nature. So it could be a chemical imbalance in your brain, in your body, that could cause the mental illness to happen. Mentally ill people are dangerous. Most people with a mental illness aren't dangerous. And if there is a violent situation, it generally happens in the same way that it would happen for somebody that isn't mentally ill. Someone feels threatened, someone might be, using a substance that causes a more aggressive reaction to a situation. Yeah.
Can use some meth and those kind of drugs cause mental illness?
So drugs will alter your brain chemistry. So yes, they can cause mental breakdowns, mental illnesses, mental problems. Yeah, that can happen. Mental illness doesn't happen in my family. How many of you heard that one? Actually, 1 in 4 families is affected by mental illness, which is a lot. That's a quarter of all families. Eating disorders affect celebrities and models and not average everyday people. Eating disorders affect everyone. And the numbers, 24 million Americans, and they claim more lives than each year than any other mental illness. And eating disorders affect males as well as females. There tends to be a myth that I guess that men are not affected by eating disorders, and that's not true. Males are affected just as much as females. So these are like just overall general myths about mental illness. Is there any comments that anybody has to make or questions that you have about this section of the talk today? Yes.
It seems to me like it would be more than 1 in 4 families that are affected, especially since COVID.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I forgot to repeat your question before. And your question before, just for the record, was, can drugs like methamphetamines or stuff like that cause mental illness? This question or comment basically is, it seems like more than 1 in 4 families is affected by mental illness, especially since COVID. And my numbers are probably from 2021, I think, and they might not have been updated at that point. So it's possible. It's possible because, I can tell you in my circle of friends and family that just about everybody I know is experiencing some sort of anxiety or depression or, not extreme mental illnesses, but more things like anxiety. That's the most common thing that students will come to my office for, is stress and anxiety. Any other comments or yes?
Would you say that 1 in 4 number might reflect a lack of diagnosis for a lot of people? Because these are just the diagnosed numbers.
Yeah, I would say that, especially with children, we'll get to children next, but let's go to there. But yes, I would say that people don't often go to the doctor or go to a therapist to get help, and so thus are not diagnosed. They just think that they can deal with it. Like it says on the first myth, just snap out of it. That still is a common mindset, that you can just make yourself better. And sometimes maybe people can. Did you have a?
Would you consider high anxiety a mental illness, or just something on the spectrum before you get to mental illness?
It depends on the severity of the anxiety. Some is very debilitating, and so would be considered a mental illness. It's definitely a mental health issue. Some people experience such debilitating anxiety that they can't move, or they have panic attacks. And for some people, it's a situational thing. Like, for instance, maybe they have anxiety about, work. And so Sunday nights they get real anxious and they feel sick or whatever. But after Monday comes around, they're fine. So yes, it's a mental illness. It's diagnosable. Anxiety is one of the diagnosable mental illnesses. The question was, is anxiety? And I forget, I'm supposed to repeat the question. Yes.
Chemistry when I say
brain chemistry, which shifts to create anxiety, mental illness, whatever it is. In other words, it's like people get a migraine, that's not really what I'm talking about. But the chemistry shifts in the brain, and first you were all good in the hood, and then next thing you know, you're like, what happened?
Yes,
Without thoughts, no thoughts, it's just the chemistry.
right. So the question is, can a brain chemistry shift cause a mental illness? And yes, that is, it happens quite often, which is why it's considered, a medical issue. Mental illness often is a chemical imbalance in your system. So, and I'm saying that I'm not quite answering your question.
Well, because you didn't take different drugs, you didn't eat different, you didn't change your routine, it just comes upon you within your body without any changes in your physical or current environment.
Mhm.
It could be changes you're just not aware of.
Right. Well, so how I would answer that is, I'm not a chemist, so I don't have a chemistry answer for that. But what I would say is, we don't often have a reason that we can point to that our body developed cancer. So I would say that a chemical imbalance can just happen because our bodies produce different chemicals all the time. And when we have, something that's happening inside us that we might not know that's happening physically, it might just be happening chemically.
It's just because my hormones.
Yes, exactly. Hormones. Okay, I'm going to go into the next slide. Kids, question first. Okay. Mhm. Mhm. Okay. That's fascinating. So for people who can't hear, she was saying that her boyfriend had was it like is that like a tumor? Okay. Okay. But that was the chemical cause of the anxiety and the panic attacks. So, and she was saying that the doctors didn't know why that happened. So things like that can happen all the time. And we just I don't think that there's actually enough research to know why things happen or why it would affect our brains one way or another. So we're going to talk about kids because there's a lot of theory that kids don't have mental illness. Kids are fine. Kids are just moody, or they're just impulsive, or kids are just kids, right? And what we're finding, especially recently, probably because we're paying more attention, but also because more research is happening, is that kids, very young kids, are experiencing depression and anxiety and lots of mental illnesses that we just didn't really consider before. We just thought they were being kids. So let's talk about kids' mental health. So first myth, young people and children don't suffer from mental health problems. So some of this I'm going to read because I don't remember all these numbers, but 6 million youth, around that number, suffer from mental health disorders that severely affect their lives, their performance in school, their performance in social situations, at home. Earlier this week or this month, oh, this is not my newest one. Okay, well, earlier this month, there's a task force. It's like a preventative medicine task force that recommended that all children between the ages of 8 and 16 on their routine physical exams be screened for anxiety. There's a task force that is like a preventative medicine task force. And earlier this month, they recommended that all children between the ages of 8 and 16 are screened for anxiety during their, well child visits or whatever. Yes. I didn't put that in my notes. It's called, it's called the US, it's like a US preventative medicine task force or something like that. I can get you I had never heard of it before, but I read about it in the news. And so I wanted to talk about that because it seems young. 8 years old seems pretty young, but I've seen it. I've seen it and heard about it a lot working with kids. Back in the back. Is a national, a US. I keep forgetting to respond to, reiterate the questions. Did you have a question?
The medical checkup thing, it's pretty obvious that lower income children are not going to get any of this.
I don't,
They need to.
well, I'm not
they
sure
don't
that's
even
true
get
because
medical exam a lot of the time. So
yeah, I don't know the numbers. The comment was maybe the lower income kids won't be getting their checkups, but I'm not sure that's true. I think that state health insurance helps people of any income.
there was a story in the paper today about lower income women who don't get pregnant. Pregnancy care and their babies die more.
Okay, I have not read that yet, so it wouldn't surprise me. There's a question in the back, and then I'll get to you. Mhm. Okay, so the comment is basically, it'll be interesting to see how we socialize the babies that were born during COVID and didn't have the typical socialization that kids had or have without the masks or without the social distancing and that kind of thing. Did you have a?
So I would suggest that in the school system is where you would find this kind of testing, because they test the eyes, they test the ears. Now we're adding mental health.
Mhm.
And with all the bullying stuff going on, this is a good item to also check. That being said, sometimes kids will change the factory to create something for themselves, but hopefully there's alerts out for that to understand the difference. But to answer her question, what about the low income? If they go to school, there's a good chance that they would, in a federally funded program, have it addressed, or at least have an opportunity for it to be addressed.
So the comment was, hopefully some of this stuff, if they're not getting it at a regular doctor's office, they would get it at school. which doesn't help the, the newborns, but, or the pregnant women, but anyhow. I'm going to move on to the next one. The next myth is childhood mental health issues are related to our parenting. And what I would say is that's, mental health issues can be genetic in nature, but are rarely caused by parenting. Do we have a comment? Yeah.
Rarely, do you mean like the other side being the trauma from their parents? Because I don't know. I obviously don't know the exact statistic, but I don't know. I feel like a lot of people I have talked to about mental health is based off trauma from their parents.
Mhm.
So is that what you're talking about? Is the rarely, is that side of that?
Yeah, so your question basically, or your comment is that what about childhood trauma? And how would that affect the mental health of kids? And I don't know enough about that, but yes, I mean, there's a thing called ACEs, which is Adverse Childhood Experience Syndrome, I think. And that's definitely an issue. And I think what they're saying is, anxiety is not caused by necessarily a parenting technique, but definitely, children can develop mental illness related to PTSD or any traumas that they would have experienced as a child. So any other comments or things on that? Yes. Okay. So what she's saying is that when working with children, if they are diagnosed-ish with some kind of anxiety disorder before the age of 6, is that right? Then they're usually marked to look at later to find out what the cause of that anxiety might be. So I don't work with little kids, and I'm not sure how to answer that question necessarily, except that I do know that childhood traumas do cause mental health issues later on. And I'm glad you asked that question, because now I'm like, what does that actually mean in regards to the myths and the facts? So maybe what they're talking about is something that I need to dig into deeper, but that's a good question. Did you have something back there?
Yeah, I was gonna. Sounds like.
Oh God. It sounds very much like it's either genetic or it has to do with parenting, but it's a lot of it can be kind of mixed and intertwined, because I think most people can have a little bit of mental illness, and chances are one of your parents had at one point a little bit of mental illness. And so yeah, maybe the percentage is pretty high of it's genetic, but I think a lot of it does have to do with parenting. And, you get to be 25, 40, whatever, and then suddenly you're dealing with how your parents hurt you when you're little, and it's passed off as genetic, but it's also has to do a lot with parenting.
Well, I think there's something to be said for there's parenting mistakes. Like you could make, for instance, you yell at your kid about something, and then that's not typical for you. But then there's also like the abusive parents. So I think that what they're saying is there's parenting mistakes and then there's abusive people. So I think as far as the myths and facts go, I think what they're talking about is like typical parenting, like mistakes that you might make with your kids. That's not going to be something that you can point at in 5 years and say, I yelled at my kid because they didn't clean their room and now they have depression. You can't really, I think what they're saying is that you can't connect those two things. But if you beat your kids every day when they're little and then they have, trauma and depression and mental illness when they're older and PTSD, then yes, of course, that's connected. So back in the back.
So just trying to find like the context of what you're talking about. Are you kind of drawing a line between like testing anxiety and like actually I can barely leave my house, and drawing a line of what's mental illness and what's just natural anxiety?
Well, I mean, we're talking about kids right now, so little kids. And yeah, I mean, I think that they're talking about more severe types of mental illness, but even anxiety or depression or just, those kind of things. But anyways, yeah, I have to move on. But all these questions are really making me think about how to move forward, especially with kids, because, a lot of you are probably learning how to be teachers or nurses or whatever, and you're going to run into a lot of this stuff with kids. It would be nice to know what the actual numbers are as far as facts. So the next one is teenagers are just moody. They're not really mentally ill. What I can say is that in any given year, 1 in 5 teenagers experiences a mental health issue, or not necessarily a crisis, but issue. And that could be depression or anxiety or panic attacks or things like that. Suicide talk is just an idle threat to get attention. We always have to take suicide talk seriously. And the numbers, yeah, it's the 3rd leading cause of death for teenagers and the 2nd leading cause of death in college students. And that's high numbers. That's more than accidents, car accidents, illnesses, things like that. So those are scary numbers. Anyway, questions, comments? Yes.
From what I've heard, a lot of the social media thing has increased problems with teenagers practically exponentially. But what is a possible solution for this? Because teenagers seem to want approval from their peers and they try to get it. And if they don't get it, they get anxiety and depression.
Yeah, well, what I would say is that's a subject that would probably take a whole hour.
Yeah, I think you're right.
So, but it's something to think about because, kids have access to a lot of information, and it's not all great information. So, okay, I'm going to move on to the next one. Basically, kids, just to recap, kids actually do suffer from mental illness. And it's not just kids being kids. Depression, not just the blues. Well, let's talk about some of the myths about depression. Children are too young to be depressed. It has to be something else. 2 million American children suffer from depression, and half of those are untreated. So we talked about like undiagnosed, and sometimes just untreated. So I think that probably relates to the whole thing. Well, kids can't be depressed. They're just being moody or whatever. It's not depression, it's just a phase. You know, and I have to say that sometimes I have a child who suffers from depression, and sometimes I think, how can you be depressed? Like, you have everything. You not like things, but just like, you know, you have love in your life. You have you know, you have things that you're good at. You have friends. You have all this stuff. How can you be depressed? But that is really not the point. The point is that there's something that's happening in his brain that causes the depression. So that is one that I have to really think about sometimes, because 19 million American adults suffer from some form of depression. 19 million. I don't know what the number is for, well, yeah, 2 million American children. All the numbers are you know, like US numbers. They're not from, you know, across the world, but it's probably relative.
Is that diagnosed depression?
I am going to assume that it's diagnosed because we've got a specific number. The last one is the elderly don't get depressed. It's just another symptom of aging. And when I read this, about 20% of the, you know, elderly Americans who suffer from depression end their lives. I was actually kind of surprised about that. But it sounds like, you know, 5 million elderly Americans suffer from depression, and 20% of those people end their lives. And that's a big number. Comments or questions about depression? Yes. Okay. I can't quite hear, I didn't quite hear that part.
I'll talk in the mic, that might help.
Thanks.
So I personally deal with OCD,
Okay.
and that has tied along with depression and stuff. And something that I've learned from that is that sometimes your parents are like, what are you depressed about? Like, there's nothing, you have everything, like you said. And sometimes even I like can feel depressed and have no idea why.
Yeah.
Like, you don't even know why. It's just like a feeling. So that's kind of something important to know about depression, is you don't always have to have a reason behind it.
Right. It could be a chemical.
Yeah,
imbalance,
exactly.
Right. And I guess that would be a time for medication or some other form of therapy. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah, because some medications won't work or some therapies won't work. Yes. I have no idea. Is anybody here a nurse? Or a doctor? Yes. The serotonin, yeah. Well, there's different levels of chemicals in your system. So there must be some way to test levels for that, but I don't know the answer to that. All I know that as a therapist, you have questionnaires that you give out to people, and they, you know, they're rated based on what their answers are, like how often do you feel this way, or how often do you feel this way, that kind of thing. And so, you know, they rate themselves from 1 to 10 or 1 to 5 or whatever. And so, yes.
I don't know if this experience is something that I tried to get an answer for your question there at one point in time, because I was feeling very tired after my daughter was born and it wasn't going away. And 2-3 years later, I was still feeling very, 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 very tired and depressed because of that.
Mhm.
And so I was diagnosed initially with postpartum depression, but it was too late after the baby. And so they put me on antidepressants, and immediately I said, I feel like a happy clown. This isn't working. And the doctor said, well, that's how we know it's not depression. We just give you a drug, and if it doesn't work, then we know it's not depression. Let's do a blood draw and see if maybe something else is going wrong. And they were able to find what was going wrong. The blood draw did figure that out, but I found that very interesting that we just are going to give me an antidepressant to see if it works.
She was saying that often if you go to the doctor and you're saying that you feel depressed, they might just give you a drug and say, let's try this and see if it works. And if it doesn't work, well, you're not depressed. I don't, I mean, I would hope that that doesn't happen all the time. I think what generally happens, or what should be happening at least, is oftentimes your medical doctor will refer you to talk therapy, so counseling while you're having your the medication, so that you get both. And then often they'll try something else if that one doesn't work, because one medication doesn't necessarily work for everybody. So yeah, I would go to a different doctor.
Oh, I'm really scared. Okay. So me personally, I think it's really scary with the fact that sometimes the doctors are just guessing. I guess that's what they have to do in some way. But I've been put on 4 different medications, and she told me from the beginning that going through that many different medications can almost make it worse, because your body is like develop or trying to adjust to all these different things. And I'm only taking them for a month, 2 months at a time. And I just find it, I don't know how you could make the, like, what I'm trying to say, make the
Like the
shift
diagnosis, you
easier.
mean?
Yeah, the
Yeah.
diagnosis, because after this many months, 5 months, 6 months, she's finally sending me to a psychiatrist. So I just don't understand why it takes that long. I don't know if that's just me personally or my experience. I don't know.
I don't know either. But I would wonder if it has something to do with your insurance and how the insurance works for you. And it doesn't seem right either to me. So, and that's one of the things, like, people, you know, we're almost out of time, and we're like halfway through, but I would say that, you know, even medical doctors might not believe that mental health is a medical illness that needs to be treated. And they just kind of like don't really know what they're doing. So I would hope that if people go to the doctor for, you know, a mental health issue, that, you know, if it's not something the doctor can recognize right away, that they would refer you out to somebody who is an expert in mental health illnesses or stuff like that. So our time is about up, and I think, wait, 10 minutes. Okay. I was thinking it was 12:15 that we were done. Okay. But I can keep going. So if you all want to stay here for longer, then I can finish up. But did you have a question or comment back there? Yeah. Mhm. So the comment was advocate for yourself. If you know something, most people know that there's something wrong. Like they just don't feel right. And it could be a physical or a mental health issue. If you don't feel right and your doctor's like, "Meh, I don't know what it is," insist upon going to someone else. Or, if you have kids, we have to advocate for our health care, because if we don't, nobody else is going to do it. And we have to advocate for our children's healthcare, because if we don't, nobody else is going to do it. So, and I think in small communities, it's really difficult because we don't have a lot of doctors to choose from. And sometimes we have to travel somewhere else to get the help that we need.
I know about the elderly question, like my friends. It seems to me to be, it's really important to be engaged with other people.
Yes.
And, if you just, I don't know, play cards or join the Y, which I feel like is wonderful, even though we don't work out much, but it's a social thing too. What are you doing? Been traveling, and then, people get used to doing that, oh, I'm going to show up and we're going to meet. And, you do all kind of games, card games, or maybe you could play Jeopardy.
Always a good idea.
Or have a coffee group, meet for coffee one day a week or something like that. So agreed. I think a lot of times elderly people get depressed because they are lonely and isolated, especially during COVID. And even maybe now, if people are sick or have other physical issues that they can't get out and be with their friends and have visitors, then it's really hard on people, because we do need a certain level of social interaction. Did you have something in the back? She's coming.
Okay. So I also think it's pretty great that like how like therapy has like evolved. Like for instance, when I was diagnosed, therapy like wasn't really talked about.
Mhm.
And so when my mom was like, "We're gonna take you to a therapist," I was like, "Great, now I'm officially a freak," you know? And so I just think that therapy is really evolved, and it's really helpful for someone to actually speak up, because it's like, "Oh, I'm seeing a therapist," and it's like, "Yeah, me too." Like I feel like everybody is like seeing a therapist nowadays. But like, yeah, I think the evolvement of therapy is really great. So
You're
Yeah.
here on that.
It should go hand in hand with any medications, I believe. And that was basically, that's the point of this whole talk, is like, there are these myths and these stigmas around mental health, and how do we get beyond them so that there isn't the stigma and people actually do get the help that they need, and advocate for themselves to get that help. And other people too. So like, like you said, being proactive, but also being what's the word? Okay with therapy and okay with seeing a therapist, or encouraging your friends to get help when they need it, or just to have someone to talk to about whatever's happening in your heart, in your life. Okay, I'm going to move to the next one, because I think I can't remember how many I have, but I might have two more. We'll see. So, what causes mental illness? Sometimes people just think it's a weakness of character, and we've already talked about that just a little bit, but let's talk about some of the issues. Homeless people. So there's a myth that homeless people with mental illness are hopeless and they can't be helped. But actually, homelessness will decrease if people have access to case management, supported safe shelters, and social services. So what that means is they're getting treatment for their mental illness. And in that regard, that helps them to be able to sustain shelter. Okay, people who need psychiatric care should be locked up in mental hospitals. Most people with who need psychiatric care can get outpatient psychiatric care, medication, talk therapy in their community and get the support that they need there. It's very rare that somebody with a psychiatric disorder would need to be hospitalized or locked up. Addicts aren't sick, they're just weak. This would be, you know, so then the research shows that, you know, a fairly high number, about 2/3 of people who have addictive personality also have a co-occurring mental health disorder. So it could be chemically related, like something's off in their chemistry and they're self-medicating, or it's like just a genetic issue that they have a more of a predisposition for addictive behavior. So that leads into the next one. Addiction is a choice that indicates lack of willpower and morality. It's a disease caused by your body chemistry is off, or it's genetic. It's not really a choice any more than cancer or diabetes is. And there's a lot of talk around that. Like, some people really believe that's true, and some people are like, nope, it's a choice. And I don't know where I stand on that myth. Although, I mean, I have to look at the numbers, but I know people, and sometimes I wonder if it really is a mental illness or if it's a choice, and it might just depend on that specific person. Troubled youth just need more discipline. I used to work in juvenile hall, and it was super fun, but you know, a lot of the kids who are in juvenile hall are incarcerated. They also have co-occurring mental illnesses that cause the behaviors. So those are the myths about who and how. Do we have any comments? Do we have a couple?
I just think it's really important to remember that when we're talking about like addiction and stuff, whether one way or the other, if we believe it's a disease or we believe the other part of it, there is no, regardless of predisposition to it. And that's really the, like, I think where people are like, oh, well, it's a choice or it's not a choice. Just remember, like, when we talk about the genetics of it, there is that predisposition regardless. So that's really was my only comment.
Yeah. Yep. And it's tough to get through that.
Okay, so I just want to share a story about recently, I think that Camp Alabama was relocated or closed, and they had something on television with the council meeting discussing where they would be moving to. And it was a possibility that they would be moving down to Gearhart by the dog park, but some conversation regarding endangered species and if there was water. Well, I also work at the Community Home Health and Hospice Care Center on 11th, and we had around that time had an influx of homeless folks that were kind of around there that were scaring some of the employees. I was there 2 weekends ago, and I walked outside and there was a homeless man that was on the bench, and I approached him. It was kind of colder, you know, and I asked him if he was okay. And he said that they closed down where he slept. And I said, they had it on the news that, you know, they were going to be moving you guys. And to Gearhart, and he said that he hadn't heard anything about it. Of course, homeless people don't have televisions to have that. As a community, it's a, you know, a part of living in a community, regardless of how many people have money or don't have money or have food. I think he was a very nice man. I don't know his story, but I know that he had a little dog with him. And he was so bogged down from not having a shower and food and a place to stay warm. I think it makes it very difficult for anybody, if it would be a year or 3 days, to go through something like that. I don't know if it's a choice or if it's believed to be a choice after so long of living that way, but I felt like a better human being just standing there with him.
So
Yeah.
regardless of whether it's a choice or an illness, it doesn't matter. Everybody's a human, right? And taking care of ourselves and each other is really important. And it's hard because a lot of times communities are overwhelmed or they don't have the services. And what do we do in those situations? You know, it's a good question to ask ourselves. How do we help? Okay. And my last section is how we can't afford to treat mental illness. That's a huge myth. We can't afford to treat it. But I think we can't afford not to treat it. When people say that mental health isn't a big enough problem for insurance to cover, if we look at the numbers, there's 54 million Americans who suffer from mental health illness mental illness every year. And half of all the primary care visits are to their primary, care are related to mental illnesses. So that's half. So how can we afford not to treat that, right? And another myth is that doctors are too overwhelmed by physical illnesses. Well, evidently half of them are being seen for physical illnesses and half of their appointments are for mental health illnesses. Mental health is a personal problem, not a societal problem. As evidenced by everybody who raised their hand today in regards to how, if they themselves or they knew somebody or had a family member who has suffered from mental health, that's just not true, right? We can see that it affects pretty much every single one of us, whether directly or, our neighbor, our friend's child, a grandparent. It affects all of us. And yeah, as far as disability goes, depression is the leading reason for disability in the country over any other physical ailments. So again, I say we can't afford not to treat it. Questions or comments on this section? We have like 2 minutes. Yes.
Depression is the leading cause of disability in the United States. Non-hard reasons.
So what I'm going to assume, a lot of my numbers came from University of Michigan, but what I'm assuming is that when they looked at the population that was on Social Security disability, that the leading cause of the disability would be depression and the inability to get through that enough to maintain a regular job. over the other physical things. So again, what I will say is mental health is definitely a problem that we all can touch in some way. And how do we move forward so that we can get past the stigma of therapy, we can get past the stigma of mental illness? How do we get past all these myths so that the facts can show up and people can really understand that mental health is just as important as physical health? And we talked about it a little bit, and I think that we just have to talk about it more. It has to become normalized, just like what I tell people when they come to my office and they say, I don't really want to go to therapy, or I don't really want to take medication, or I don't think I have a problem. Then I say, well, if you needed glasses, would you get glasses? If you needed insulin, would you go to the doctor and get insulin? If you needed, surgery, would you get surgery? Yes, they would in all those situations. So I think for those of us who are interested and care about, our fellow human beings, then just making sure that we are encouraging to people who are struggling to get help, to seek therapy, and make it a lot more normalized than it is even now, even though it's better now than it was 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And that's, I think, our first steps is just combating the stigmas and the myths so that people feel like it's worth getting help for, or okay to get help for. Any comments on that?
I do actually.
Okay.
So this reminds me of Simone Biles, the gymnast.
Yes.
And she talked about how she goes to therapy regularly, and that's become one of her rotations. So, she does balance beam, and then she does vault, and then she goes to therapy. And that's part and parcel of how she's successful as a gymnast, but also how she continues to be healthy both in mind and body, because those two things are connected. We look at, getting glasses, getting hearing aids, we think, oh, those are about the body. Those aren't about, your brain. Well, your brain is part of your body.
Right.
So
Our
there's
brain
no
is an
way we can
organ.
separate them.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think she's done a lot to sort of break down some of those barriers and say, look, this is a useful and needed practice, and there should be no shame around it.
Yeah. It's getting better. There's a lot more talk. So yes.
What they need to do is to put more effort and more money into this, and nobody seems to be willing to do that. They don't put enough money and effort into other physical illnesses, and they put even less into mental illnesses. They need to make more of an effort. All they seem to be interested in is making money.
Thank you. Yes.
They'd be making money if people were going to therapy.
Some people would. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you all so much for showing up. I'm really happy that you're here, and it sounds like we have lots of conversations that could, be continued. We're out of time, but you're welcome to stay, and I have half an hour that I can be here to answer questions or just talk.
Thank you,
So,
Jennifer, and thank you
you.
to all who came today.